I grew up learning to read people early, mostly because of Elaine. When she married my dad, I could tell the difference between the smile she showed him and the look she gave me when his back was turned. She didn't yell or make scenes. She just made me feel like I was in the way. If I sat on the couch, she'd suggest I do my homework in my room. If I joined them for breakfast, she'd remind me there was cereal upstairs. Dad never caught it. He thought she was just trying to help. As I got older, she became more subtle but more controlling. She started making decisions in the house that pushed me out of family space. The photos of my mom disappeared from the walls. Her furniture was moved to the basement. If I asked about it, she'd say she was decluttering or making the house feel fresh. I didn't want to upset Dad, so I let things go. I spent more time in my room or at friends' houses to avoid the tension. When I turned 16, she convinced Dad I should get a part-time job to build responsibility. I didn't mind working, but I realized later she wanted me out of the house as much as possible. She never said it directly, but everything she did made it clear this wasn't my home anymore. It was hers, and I was just passing through. Dad thought she was being supportive, and I didn't want to burden him with drama. She had a way of acting caring in front of him. If I came home late, she'd tell him she'd been worried. If I was quiet at dinner, she'd ask if I needed anything. Then, when he stepped away, she'd lean in and whisper, "Don't forget whose house you're in." It was always quiet enough that I couldn't prove anything. Leaving for college felt like a relief. I didn't go out of state, but I stayed in the dorms. Dad offered to pay for everything, but she nudged him into making me cover some of my expenses. He thought it would help me grow up. I didn't argue. Being away from her was payment enough. I still came home for holidays, but every time I did, something else of mine was gone. Old boxes, childhood awards, even things my mom left me. If I asked, she'd shrug and say she didn't know where they ended up. When I visited my dad alone, things felt somewhat normal. He'd cook, talk about work, and ask about my classes. But whenever Elaine walked in, the air changed. She inserted herself into every conversation and made it seem like I was lucky to be invited. If I stayed the night, she'd mention how the guest room needed to stay tidy because it wasn't permanent space. I didn't push back. I kept my distance, focused on school, and tried to build a life that didn't rely on her approval. What I didn't know then was that she believed she had already won, that she'd eventually erase me from everything. Elaine always found a way to make me feel like I didn't belong. If there was a family trip being planned, I'd hear about it at the last minute, usually when it was already too late to join. She'd tell Dad I was busy with school or friends, and he believed her. Holidays felt even worse. I'd come home expecting to eat with them, only to find out they'd already had dinner at a restaurant or at one of her relatives' houses. She'd smile and say, "We didn't want to bother you," like she was doing me a favor. Even on regular nights, she managed to leave me out. There were times I'd come back from work or class and see the table set for two. She'd claim she thought I wasn't coming or that I could fix myself something later. Dad never questioned it. He trusted her completely, and she used that to shape what he believed about me. He was busy most of the time, running his contracting company and meeting clients. Elaine handled the house, his schedule, and even his calls when he was home. She made herself the center of everything so smoothly that it looked natural. To him, she was just being a supportive wife. To me, she was slowly pushing me to the edge. By the time I finished high school, I barely felt like I lived there. My room was still mine, but I could tell she hated that I was still under the same roof. She started dropping hints that I should think about the next step. At first, she disguised it as encouragement. She'd say things like, "You're almost an adult now," or "It'll be good for you to have your own space." When I turned 18, she finally said it outright. She suggested I get an apartment and learn responsibility. She brought it up in front of Dad, making it sound like the normal thing to do. She told him it would help me grow and make my own way. He looked proud when she said it, like they were both launching me into my future. I didn't realize she was just clearing the house of someone she saw as competition. I didn't have a problem working, so I got a job and saved up. Elaine made it easier for Dad to let go by acting like I was ready. She said she'd help me move and even offered to help look for places. At the time, I thought she was trying to support me. I didn't understand she wanted space without me around. When I moved into a small apartment across town, she acted like she was proud of me. She hugged me in front of Dad and said she'd always be there if I needed anything. As soon as I left, the calls from the house stopped. No more invitations to dinner. No check-ins unless Dad made the effort. I didn't see how she was using my absence to become the only person in his ear. From the outside, it looked like I was becoming independent. In reality, she was cutting me off while making sure Dad thought everything was fine. I had no idea then how much control she was tightening behind the scenes. That mattered. She had no idea my dad wasn't as blind as she thought. Dad's health started going downhill fast. He'd always been strong and active, so when he began missing work and canceling jobs, I knew something was wrong. I found out through one of his old co-workers that he'd been in and out of doctor's appointments. No one told me, not even Elaine. When I called to check on him, she acted surprised that I was concerned. She said he was just tired, and that everything was under control. I didn't believe her, so I drove over one morning without warning. Dad looked weaker than I'd ever seen him. His skin was pale, and he moved slowly, like even standing up cost him energy. Elaine hovered around him like a guard, answering questions for him and reminding me how stressful it was to have people coming in and out of the house. She said he needed quiet and that I should let her manage things. I stayed for a couple of hours, but she made it clear I wasn't welcome. Every time I tried to talk to Dad alone, she found a reason to interrupt or stand nearby. She mentioned medications, appointments, paperwork, anything to show she had it all handled. When I left that day, I felt uneasy. Something about the way she controlled the situation didn't sit right with me. A few days later, I got a text from Dad. He asked me to come by in the afternoon when Elaine would be at work. It was the first time he'd reached out directly in a while. When I showed up, he was sitting at the kitchen table with a folder of test results. He looked tired but more clear-headed without her around. He told me he'd been diagnosed with a serious heart condition and that things had progressed faster than expected. We talked for the first time in years without tension. He said he knew I probably felt pushed out and that he regretted not paying more attention. He admitted I should have been kept in the loop and that he'd trusted Elaine to include me. He didn't try to defend her. He just apologized for not seeing everything sooner. Then he told me something that caught me off guard. He said he'd been thinking about updating his will. He didn't go into detail, but he said he wanted to make things right and ensure I wasn't left out of what he had built. He mentioned wanting to meet with his lawyer soon, but he needed time to figure out how to handle Elaine without causing a fight. I didn't push him. I just listened. For the first time in a long time, I felt like he was really talking to me, not as someone being managed by her, but as my father. Before I left that day, he asked me not to mention our conversation to Elaine. He said he needed me to keep visiting when I could, especially when she wasn't around. I walked out of the house with mixed feelings, sadness over his health, anger at being left in the dark, and a small spark of hope that maybe he finally saw the truth. I didn't know then how fast things would move or how much Elaine was already preparing to take control. After that first visit, I started coming by more often, but only when Elaine was gone. Dad and I would talk quietly in the kitchen or his room. He'd ask about my job, my apartment, and if I needed anything. Each time I left, he'd make me promise to keep our talks between us. I could tell he didn't want to fight with her while he was sick. Elaine started catching on that I was around more. Even if she didn't know the details, she didn't like it. Whenever she saw me in the house, her attitude shifted. She made comments that looked harmless on the surface but had a sharp edge. If I brought groceries or helped clean up, she'd say things like, "You don't have to pretend now," or "We've managed fine without your sudden interest." One day, I noticed the home office door was locked. It had never been locked before. When I asked about it, she said she needed privacy for sensitive paperwork and that too many hands caused confusion. I knew she meant me. If Dad asked her for something kept in there, she'd tell him she'd handle it later. He didn't argue, probably because he was too tired. Every time I showed up, she acted annoyed, like I was interrupting a routine she had perfected. She'd complain about me adding stress or crowding the house. If I tried to sit with Dad in the living room, she'd suddenly claim he needed rest and suggest I leave. If I stayed anyway, she'd hover in the hallway or pretend to clean just to watch us. She also spoke about the house like it already belonged to her. I'd hear her on the phone talking about her place and her plans after things settled down. She never said those things in front of Dad, but she didn't bother hiding it from me. It was like she wanted me to know I wasn't part of anything long-term. When Dad's condition got worse, I tried staying overnight a few times. She made a big deal about it each time. She'd claim there wasn't enough space or that I was disrupting his rest. The last week before he passed, she barely let me in the door. She said he was too weak for conversations and that I should wait for updates. He passed early on a Sunday morning. I found out because the hospital called me, not her. I got to the house before the funeral home arrived. Elaine was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee like she had been waiting. She was calm, too calm. I asked if she needed help and she just said, "Everything is already arranged." In the days leading up to the funeral, she treated me like an unwanted guest. She told relatives when to come but forgot to tell me the same times. When I stayed at the house one night, she reminded me it was only temporary and said, "Let the real family handle things." I didn't react, but I remembered every word. I stayed quiet because I didn't want to make a scene during Dad's last arrangements. She thought my silence meant she had full control. She had no idea what he'd already set in motion without her knowing. About a week after the funeral, I got an email from the lawyer's office with the date and time for the will reading. Elaine didn't call or text me about it. She acted like it was some formality she had to get through, nothing more. I showed up because I wanted to be there for my dad, even if she assumed I was just wasting time. When I arrived at the law office, she was already there with her daughter, Tessa. I hadn't seen Tessa much growing up. She moved out when I was still in high school and only came around for holidays a few times. Even then, she acted like I was just someone passing through the house. The two of them were dressed like they were attending a business deal, not something tied to my father's life. They sat together on one side of the waiting area. Elaine wore a look that said she was in control. Tessa crossed her legs, scrolling on her phone like none of it mattered. Neither of them acknowledged me when I walked in. I nodded once, more out of habit than respect, but they didn't bother responding. Elaine kept glancing at me with that same smug expression she'd worn at the funeral. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a quiet confidence, like she'd already secured everything. To her, the meeting was just a step to make it official. She probably thought Dad's house, his business shares, and his savings were already hers to manage. When the assistant came out to call us in, Elaine stood up like she owned the place. Tessa followed, not saying a word. I walked behind them but didn't rush or try to catch up. They went straight to the conference room and took the seats closest to the lawyer's chair. They didn't leave space for me at the table, so I grabbed another chair and sat across from them. Even then, she didn't speak to me. She leaned over and whispered something to Tessa, and they both shared a small laugh. I ignored it and focused on why I was there. I wasn't thinking about money or property. I just wanted to hear what my dad had decided. He told me before he passed that he would make things right. I held on to that. The lawyer, Mr. Halpern, walked in with a file under his arm. I recognized him from when I was younger. He'd worked with Dad for years, handling contracts and legal paperwork for the business. He greeted me with a respectful nod, then looked briefly at Elaine and Tessa without much warmth. He didn't waste time with small talk. Elaine crossed her arms and leaned back in her chair, like she was waiting to sign off on something. Tessa sat relaxed with a blank look, as if she already knew the outcome. I stayed quiet, watching and listening. I didn't react to anything they did. I just waited. In that room, I felt the same mix of anger and grief I'd been carrying since Dad got sick. But there was also a steady calm underneath it. Whatever they thought was going to happen, I was ready to hear the truth. I didn't need to prove anything to them. I was there for my father, not for their approval. Before the lawyer could even sit down properly, Elaine made her move. She stood up like she was giving a speech and said loudly, "Just so everyone's aware, Mason has been removed from Richard's will. He chose to leave everything to his wife, like any good husband would." She didn't look at Mr. Halpern when she said it. Her eyes were locked on me, waiting for a reaction. I didn't say anything. I didn't flinch or ask questions. I just looked back at her and stayed quiet. That seemed to bother her more than if I'd argued. She expected me to look shocked, hurt, maybe even walk out. When that didn't happen, she pressed her lips together and sat back down like she had made her point. Tessa barely looked up from her phone, but I could see a small smile on her face. She was enjoying it in her own quiet way. She crossed one leg over the other and leaned back, acting like this was already settled. Mr. Halpern didn't react to Elaine's announcement. He placed his file on the table, adjusted his glasses, and asked everyone to sit. His tone was steady, not rushed or thrown off. He didn't respond to what she said at all. It was as if her little speech held no legal meaning, which clearly she didn't expect. Elaine leaned back in her chair with this satisfied grin, like she had just ended the meeting before it began. She folded her hands and stared at me again, almost daring me to challenge her. I still said nothing. I just waited for the lawyer to speak. The room felt tense, but not because of me. It was her energy filling it. She thought she was closing a door in my face, and she wanted me to feel it. But I remembered what Dad told me in the kitchen weeks before he died. I held on to that memory and let her talk. Mr. Halpern finally spoke, and he did it calmly. He didn't acknowledge her statement. He simply said he had the final version of Richard Carter's will and trust documents, and that he would read them in full. He also mentioned that only legally documented decisions mattered, not assumptions or personal claims. Elaine shifted slightly in her seat, but she kept her chin up. She seemed sure the paper in that file would match her story. She looked over at Tessa, and then at me again, like she was about to enjoy watching me be cut out officially. I stayed still. I didn't argue or defend myself. There was nothing to defend. The truth was in those documents, not in her voice. I could feel my heart beating hard, but I kept control of my face and my body. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me react. In that moment, I realized something important. She wasn't confident. She was loud because she was nervous. She needed everyone to believe her version before the truth came out. She didn't know what Dad had done in the end. She only assumed she'd managed to lock everything down. I just sat there and let her believe whatever she wanted, because the real answer was about to come from someone she couldn't talk over. Mr. Halpern didn't waste time arguing with Elaine. He simply asked her to sit so he could begin. His tone wasn't rude, but it was firm enough to show he was in charge of the room. She hesitated for a second, then sat down like she didn't want to look out of place. He opened his folder and took out 2 sealed envelopes. One had Elaine's name on it, and the other had mine. He placed them on the table without explaining what was inside. She glanced at hers like she already knew it confirmed everything she had claimed. I didn't touch mine. I waited for him to speak. He started by explaining that my dad had updated his will more than once over the last year. He said that earlier versions were no longer valid, and that only the most recent version had any legal standing. Elaine didn't like hearing that. She shifted in her seat and crossed her arms, but she stayed quiet for the moment. He spoke clearly and without drama. He said my dad had come to his office several times in the months before he died. Each visit had resulted in adjustments, and every update was properly signed and witnessed. He made it clear that there was nothing uncertain or unfinished about the process. The final version was complete and binding. Elaine looked at him like she wanted to interrupt, but he didn't pause long enough for her to jump in. He explained that my dad had made sure everything was filed correctly and that there would be no confusion about what he wanted. Tessa finally looked up from her phone, maybe realizing this wasn't going the way they expected. I stayed silent, just listening. I remembered the day Dad told me he wanted to make things right. I didn't know exactly what he'd done, but I trusted that he meant what he said. Hearing the lawyer talk about those updates confirmed that Dad hadn't just left things the way Elaine claimed. Mr. Halpern then said he would go through the official documents in order. He made it clear that nobody's opinion in the room mattered, only what was written and signed by my father. His voice never rose, but there was no room for argument. He wasn't there to discuss feelings or assumptions. Elaine leaned back and tried to look calm, but she kept glancing at the envelope with her name on it. She expected it to guarantee her control, but I could tell the confidence she had earlier was starting to fade around the edge. Tessa didn't look as relaxed as before either. The lawyer didn't open the envelopes yet. He said they were to be read after certain parts of the will had been covered. That alone seemed to bother Elaine. She wasn't used to not leading the conversation or setting the pace. I sat there quietly, taking it all in. I didn't need to speak or defend anything. The process was moving forward, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. For the first time in a long while, I felt like the truth was finally in the room, and it wasn't coming from her. Mr. Halpern began reading the will, and the room went quiet. Elaine sat straight with her arms crossed, acting like she already knew what it said. But the moment he mentioned the trust, her posture changed. He explained that my dad had moved the house, his savings, and his business shares into a legal trust months before he passed. None of it was listed under Elaine's name. She blinked a few times, like she didn't understand what she was hearing. Tessa looked over at her, waiting for some kind of reaction. Mr. Halpern didn't pause. He went on to say that the trust had only one beneficiary. I didn't move or say a word. I just listened. Elaine, on the other hand, shifted in her chair and leaned forward like she needed to correct him. But before she could speak, he continued reading the next part. He said my dad had made it clear that I would receive ownership and control of the house, the remaining savings, and his business interests. There was no shared ownership, no split, no mention of Elaine as a co-beneficiary. Everything major was tied to the trust, and the trust was tied to me alone. That's when the silence in the room changed. Elaine stopped pretending to be calm. Her jaw tightened, and she looked at Mr. Halpern like he was making it up. Tessa finally put her phone down and sat up straight. Then came the part about them. Mr. Halpern read that Elaine and Tessa would receive a small monthly stipend, but only under specific conditions. The payments would continue as long as their behavior stayed respectful toward me and the estate. If there was harassment, interference, or legal trouble, the stipend would stop. Elaine let out a short, dry laugh, like it was some kind of joke. But Mr. Halpern didn't react. He kept reading as if her opinion didn't matter. He said my dad had planned it that way because he wanted to avoid arguments and ensure there was no confusion over who was responsible for his legacy. Tessa whispered something to her mother, but I couldn't hear what it was. Elaine didn't respond to her. She just stared at the lawyer with a look that was part anger, part disbelief. She had expected full control, and instead she was being handed a condition. I didn't smile or make any comment. I wasn't there to rub anything in. I just let the truth stand on its own. It was clear that Dad had thought this through. He didn't leave room for anyone to twist the situation. Mr. Halpern set the papers down for a moment and said that everything was legally secured. The trust couldn't be changed or challenged without serious evidence, and given Dad's clear instructions, there was nothing open for debate. Elaine didn't speak right away. She sat back slowly, holding her envelope but not opening it. For the first time, she didn't look like she was in charge. She looked like someone who had just watched a plan fall apart without warning. I stayed quiet and waited for what came next. Elaine's face turned red the moment the lawyer mentioned there were recordings. She tried to talk over him, repeating that Dad had been confused and that someone must have influenced him. Mr. Halpern ignored her protests and unlocked a small black recorder he had brought with the case file. He explained that during Dad's last hospital stays, he met with him privately several times. Dad had asked him to document his wishes so no one could twist his words or challenge his decisions later. When the first recording played, the room went very still. Dad's voice was weak but clear. He said he loved his wife but could no longer ignore how I had been treated. He said he had made mistakes by staying silent while Elaine pushed me aside. He talked about watching her slowly take control of his accounts, paperwork, and property. He admitted he should have acted earlier, but wanted to fix things while he still could. He said he didn't want anyone to claim later that he was pressured or confused. Elaine tried to interrupt again, saying the recording was fake, but Mr. Halpern held up his hand and continued the playback. In another clip, Dad explained exactly why he created the trust. He said that after seeing how things were handled during his illness, he was afraid that once he passed, I would be completely cut out. He said I came to help even when I wasn't asked, and that he knew Elaine resented it. He said he wanted to protect me from being used or discarded and wanted to make sure I was respected. Tessa shifted in her chair, looking uncomfortable for the first time. She glanced at her mother, but Elaine was too angry to notice. She was pacing behind the table, muttering that the lawyer was overstepping and that none of this should matter. Mr. Halpern finally paused the audio and spoke calmly. He said everything was recorded with witnesses, and the hospital verified Dad's mental clarity during each meeting. He said the paperwork was properly signed, dated, and filed. Instead of calming down, Elaine accused me of working with the lawyer behind her back. She said I must have visited Dad secretly and convinced him to change everything. I didn't respond. There was nothing to argue. Mr. Halpern reminded her that she was not at the hospital every hour and that Dad had every right to speak privately to his attorney. He also pointed out that family members could not influence legal documents created under professional supervision. Elaine then tried a different angle. She said Dad never would have humiliated his own wife. She insisted she had taken care of him for years and deserved everything. The lawyer didn't raise his voice. He simply said Dad had acknowledged her efforts by including the monthly stipend and that it was more than fair, considering his final instructions. The last recording was short. Dad said he didn't want his death to turn into another excuse for cruelty or entitlement. He mentioned that if anyone tried to fight his wishes, the trust had protections to prevent assets from being frozen or challenged without proof of fraud. He ended by saying he hoped I would finally have peace without being pushed to the side again. When the playback ended, there was silence. Elaine didn't have another interruption left in. She stood frozen, breathing hard, as if the room had shifted without her permission. The truth had. Elaine didn't accept the outcome right away. After the recordings were played and the documents were confirmed, she tried one last push. She said she would hire her own lawyer and take everything to court. Mr. Halpern didn't seem bothered. He told her the trust had been reviewed twice, witnessed properly, and registered. He explained that contesting it would cost her more than she could gain, and unless she had proof of fraud or coercion, which she didn't, no judge would overturn it. For the first time, she hesitated. The anger in her voice faded into frustration. Even Tessa looked unsure, no longer sitting like she owned the room. They both realized the fight wasn't going anywhere. Within a week, I received notice from Mr. Halpern that the trust had officially transferred all assets into my name. The house, the business shares, the bank accounts, and the land were legally protected. Elaine and Tessa were only allowed what Dad had stated in writing, and only if they behaved with respect, which had already become unlikely. Moving them out of the house wasn't dramatic. The lawyer sent a formal notice giving them 2 weeks to leave. Elaine tried to negotiate, saying she needed more time and that the house held her memories. But she couldn't argue with the fact that Dad had removed her name from the deed months earlier. Tessa packed her things quietly, avoiding eye contact. Neighbors who once heard her brag about becoming the lady of the house now watched her load boxes in silence. I didn't throw anyone out. I didn't yell or make a scene. I just followed the instructions Dad left behind. When the 2 weeks ended, I changed the locks and had the trust manager update all property records. Elaine called once more, demanding a meeting, but I let Mr. Halpern handle the response. He reminded her of the conduct clause and warned that if she caused trouble, even the monthly payments could stop. The business was something I had to think about carefully. Dad had built it over the years, and even though it wasn't my dream, I respected what it meant to him. I met with his accountant and decided to close it the right way instead of selling it to people who didn't care about his legacy. I paid off outstanding obligations, released employees with proper settlements, and shut it down on my own timeline. No one could claim I misused anything. Everything was documented and handled cleanly. Keeping the family property felt different now. There was no noise, no tension, no one trying to control the space. For the first time, I could walk through the halls without hearing Elaine's voice in the back of my mind. I visited Dad's room and sat there for a while, thinking about the promises he made and how he kept them, even when he wasn't here to see it. There was no moment of shouting or revenge in the way people imagine it. It wasn't about humiliating anyone. The payback was in the silence that followed when all their planning failed. Everything they assumed was already there slipped away without a fight, and I didn't have to lift anything but a signature. It ended exactly how Dad wanted, quiet, firm, and final. Already been spoken, in Dad's own voice, with no space left to twist it.